Welcome all of you. This one more session. It's we already done 21 different session on webinars. So today we are lucky to have Pradip. We don't need an introduction of Pradip. So let me introduce the two NGOs which have been doing this. This is from Kerala, Kottayam Nature Society and Alappuzha Naturalistic Society. They do a lot of grassroots conservation works there. They are associated with the webinar. Whatever things happen there, they are the one who looks after there. They literally go and fight till Supreme Court to get things done. So they've been doing all those things. One day they started, let's do, anyway, we are sitting in home doing nothing, let's do some webinars. So we managed to get a lot of amazing speakers. Tomorrow, Dr. Rewilding is going to speak about lions, conservation of Asiatic lions. And like that, we have a very good, amazing speakers. And thank you so much, Pradip, for agreeing to give a talk. And I think over to you. You can take over from there.
Okay, so what I plan to do today is to say a little bit about the project in Jodhpur, which started in 2005, 2006. So it's been, what, 15, 16 years now since we began. And perhaps I'll talk a little bit more about the other work I've done in other parts of the desert in Rajasthan. And then I'm hoping that this will become more like a question and answer session. So if people have, if they're curious about something and they want to ask me something, then I'll be very happy to talk about it. So to jump straight into Jodhpur, this picture you see on the screen in front of you is a part of a rocky outcrop next to Mehrangarh Fort in Jodhpur. Mehrangarh is this amazing fort that was built in the 16th century at the top of this rocky outcrop. And there is an old city wall that encloses part of that rocky outcrop behind, and then the wall goes down into the city. So all the land between the old city wall and the fort was basically, that formed the land that later became the Rao Joda Park. So 2005, essentially, I was invited to come to this place to take a look at it and to see whether I would be prepared to attempt to rewild it. And what is interesting about, what was interesting about the place then was that, first of all, it's extremely rocky. There's hardly any soil there. All of this rock that you see in front of you is a volcanic rock called rhyolite, which goes back to a time roughly 750 million years ago, when you had volcanic explosions in this area, which was then, of course, joined next to Africa and Antarctica and Australia in Pangaea, right? One of the most frightening things about this area was that even though this picture you see in front of you is a picture of a watercolor that was done by an English artist towards the end of the 19th century. And there was really very little information available about what was growing in this rocky land next to the fort. And all you could really make out in this picture was the forms of these Euphorbia bushes. Euphorbia being often referred to as cacti mistakenly. But this is very typical of the vegetation that clothes rocky parts of the desert. And other than these cactoid euphorbias that you see in this picture, there was very little else to actually tell you what was growing here. One thing that was very apparent was that there was a time, sometime in the 1930s, when somebody came to Maharaja Umed Singh and said, Maharaja, if you want to green your desert kingdom, then there's a very simple solution. There's this tree called Prosopis juliflora, which comes from Mexico and further south in South America, which doesn't seem to need water. It doesn't need any kind of nutrients in the soil. It grows pretty much everywhere.
Pradeep, sorry to butt in between. I'm just closing your video because the sound is distracting a bit. So you'll get a better bandwidth without video.
Okay.
Okay, is that okay?
Yes, it's fine with me. Shall I carry on?
Yeah, please.
All right. So Maharaj Umed Singh was told that if he could bring in the seeds of Possipis juliflora in large quantities, it would effectively green the entire kingdom of Jodhpur, which you have to remember was a lot larger than the district of Jodhpur is today, because Jodhpur, the kingdom of Jodhpur extended all the way to the boundaries of Rajasthan with Gujarat. Now, Maharaja Umed Singh used to fly his own airplane, and in my mind's eye, I imagine him sitting there, flying his airplane with literally hundreds of bags full of seeds of Possipis juliflora, which he broadcast throughout his kingdom. And this picture you see on your screen now shows you the difference between what it was like in 1896 before juliflora was everywhere, and the picture that was taken in 2005, where we actually see the entire place overrun with Possipis juliflora. These three pictures show you what it was like in 2005, 2006, before we actually began work. So this was our immediate set of challenges. One, the fact that it was extremely rocky with very, very little soil. Two, the fact that it was completely overrun with an invasive plant that is notoriously difficult to eradicate and to remove, because it keeps coming back. And I guess the third impediment, the third problem was that there was very little information available about what actually grew here before it had become a wasteland. So these are the three things we set about trying to solve. The first was actually finding a group of traditional miners from Marwar, from this region called Marwar, who we actually tried very hard to find out from locally whether there were any local solutions to getting rid of Possipis juliflora, which is called Bavlia. It's called, the local name for Possipis is Bavlia. That means the mad plant. And all sorts of cockeyed ideas were actually suggested to us. Somebody said, just cut it at ground level and put fresh gobar on it. Somebody else said, on a moonlit night, say a particular mantra, and rubbishy stuff. Somebody even suggested use dynamite. But eventually somebody said, why don't you try the traditional miners of Rajasthan, of Marwar? And we were skeptical because the traditional building stone that is used in Jodhpur is actually sandstone. And sandstone is a whole lot softer than rhyolite, which is much, much harder, even harder than granite. But we called the leader of this gang and we said, look, can you show us whether you can actually go down at least 2.5, 3 feet into this rock, because that's where the budding zone of the root is of Possipis juliflora. And if you don't go down that much, it just resprouts. And to cut a long story short, they showed us in a very short time that they had techniques and they had learned ways of carving up this rock, essentially by using their hammers and listening to the sound of the hammers on the rock, which gave them all the information they needed to know how it's interbedded, kahan se pola hai, kahan se bhara hai, all the information. And we realized that this was, in fact, our only, sustainable solution, which is, not to use toxic chemicals, not to use dynamite, which would have blown up all the takeries here, but to hire our little cricket team of Khandwalias, they're called Khandwalias, and employ them to literally take out, bush by bush and tree by tree, even if it was going to take, 6 or 7 or 8 years. So this is what we did. We employed 15 Khandwalias using their chisels and their hammers. They literally went, tree by tree. And I have a memory that first year, the picture that you see at the bottom right, I remember looking at it, it had become completely bare. There were no prosopis trees left there. And we started, basically the solution we thought of was that wherever Bavlia grows, wherever prosopis was growing, we were going to create a pit, a planting pit in the hole that had been vacated by the Bavlia. So you can see the holes in the pictures, and it looked a little bit like a piece of Swiss cheese with all these holes. And I thought, my God, what arrogance on my part to think that I know exactly what needs to happen here. And what if I fail? What if we bring in plants and we don't manage to actually get them to grow here? And I remember feeling a sense of panic and, just thinking that, my God, I don't really have experience of working in the desert. I don't know the desert well enough. What if we fail? And I thought, well, if nothing else works, we'll just grow some more Prosopis juliflora from seed and put it back. And that was the consolation for me. But in fact, what happened was that we actually had fairly good results. I'm going to show you a series of before and after pictures just to give you a sense of, how the planting went. The picture that you're seeing on your screen now at the top left shows you with part of the park that was still full of Prosopis juliflora, growing quite lushly in the lower levels where there was a little bit of soil washed down from the top, and then up on the hills where the soil is almost completely absent. You only have bushes of Prosopis juliflora. And then what you see in the larger picture on the bottom right is the Prosopis having been removed. Some of the neem trees, the big dark trees that you see, there are neem trees that existed even in the earlier picture but had been suppressed by the Prosopis. And they must have been already old enough to spring up and gain height very, very quickly. So there's only a difference of 3 years between these two pictures. In the next set of pictures, it's a similar area, but you can see that by 2011 and 2013, there was kind of dramatic, increase in the vegetation in this area. Now, what I'm not showing you, and in a way I'm, perhaps don't have the luxury of being able to tell you that whole story, is that we had to do a lot of learning about which particular plants were going to manage to subsist where they were being planted. This is not something that we knew to start with, because if you actually look at a flora of the desert, if you look at most floras anywhere in India, there is very little ecological information. There's very little information that tells you that these are the kinds of conditions or the kind of soil or the kind of moisture regime that particular plants need. So we had to find out by trial and error. And what we did, in fact, was that whenever we planted for the first 3 years, we kept a record of the kind of pit it was in, the depth of the pit. We were varying the soil types that we were using in the planting zones. We were recording the species that was being planted in these pits, and each pit was given a number. Sorry, am I? Somebody say something to me? No. Yeah. So after we kept these records for 3 years, some of this began to make sense. And when you put, if you record all this information on an Excel sheet, for example, what you can do is you can get the Excel sheet to report back to you by putting together all the same species, for example. And some of this began to fall into place and make complete sense. So this was part of the learning that we had to do. And part of the learning also was about beginning to discover things like this particular grass. And this is a grass called Oropetium, right? Oropetium is the common name is rock grass. And what is special about Oropetium is that it's a tiny grass that looks quite dead in the dry season. It's sometimes referred to as an annual, but it's in fact not an annual. It's a perennial grass that becomes dormant. And it has a symbiotic relationship with liverworts. And you can see the liverworts, especially in the upper picture on the left. And we realized quite quickly that what Oropitium does in the desert, in rocky parts of the desert, is that it becomes a starter, like a starter medium on rock. It's what allows rocks to be colonized first by soil and later by plants. So we were very excited when we discovered this. Again, this was not something that was available in books or in floras. So it was a question of actually making these discoveries ourselves. And Oropitium became a key, a key ingredient in whenever we were trying to place soil on rock. This picture was not taken in the desert, but it just shows you how you can get vast areas, stony areas, colonized by grass to begin with, and then later by bigger plants, if you have Oropitium growing there. This again is a picture showing you a substrate of Oropitium. So basically the soil has been held in place by the grass, and the soil keeps growing and the grass grows on top of that, and then other grasses are able to grow on top of that. So again, I've got a set of pictures here just to show you how one particular area of the park was actually rewilded using Oropitium as our key ally. So this is a particular place called the Hathi Naher. It later became part of a trail we used in the park that we call the Yellow Trail. And the Hathi Naher basically brings water from the hills towards the west of Jodhpur in a canal that was hand dug 500 years ago. But when we found it in 2006, it looked roughly like this. This picture is taken in 2008, but there was virtually nothing growing around it except for a little bit of monsoon grasses. And then over the next few years, by this time we've learned a lot more about the plants that will actually take in these areas. And then 2009, 2010, 11, we've had a lot more success growing things on the sides of Hathi Naher. And here we are planting little soil clods of Oropitium into tiny little ledges in the rock, which then become part of the starter medium that we're going to be using, right? And then this is now 2013, so roughly 4.5 years after we begin to work on this area, right? And then this is Hathi Naher in 2015, during the monsoon when you actually have water trickling down the man-made canal. So these are some of the things that we learned how to do. This is what Mehrangarh looks like now, 2 years ago actually, where there's this wonderful moment where you have individual trees, right, with separate canopies, and then the canopies join up and become a forest. That's what happened in this particular area at the base of Mehrangarh here. Now, I do have more pictures to show you about other work that has happened in the desert. This is a picture of our visitor center, where we tried to create a small miniaturized garden of native plants from the desert, just to show how well they will do, provided you choose them correctly. But hereafter, I have other things to talk about, but I'd much rather, if I may, David, get into fielding questions, and then if anything is relevant, I'll show more pictures. Can we do that?
I think please go ahead. I'll just open the chat box.
Okay.
Yeah, I just opened. If you have any questions.
So these pictures here on screen now show you an area behind our visitor center where we had a parking area that wasn't being used. And one of the things that happened with us was that we would make these forays into the desert looking for plants, looking for seed. And we'd very often find plants that were very, they were eminently bring-backable. We wanted to bring them back, but we knew we didn't have the right soil or the right minerals in which they would grow. And so we would envy these plants and take pictures of these plants and get to know them, but we knew that we couldn't grow them within the park. And then we had the idea of why can't we make little raised beds in our parking lot and create like a little museum of, katoras, if you like, with a column of soil, with the right kind of soil, and then grow these plants. So this was the beginning of that project, where we decided that we create these, we call them microhabitats. And in each microhabitat, we bring back, so essentially the procedure was, we arrive at a particular place. Let's say we arrived at a gravelly field where you get plants that are, we knew wouldn't grow, this is iron-rich gravel, which we don't have in the park. We would then collect seed from the top of the soil, or we collect seed-bearing soil and put that into bags, into empty cement bags. And then we'd collect more of the soil in a truck and bring it back and fill it into one of these raised beds. And then put the top, fill on top the seed-bearing soil that we'd collected, and then wait for the rains. And we had the most amazing results. So just to follow through with one of these ideas, this is a picture of a particular soil that we call glass sand. It's essentially also very iron rich. And this, if you can see are you able to see my cursor on the screen? My cursor is pointing to a tiny little plant that we found, a succulent plant way deep in the desert called salsola. And salsola is reputedly very difficult to grow from seed and really quite hard to tame. So the lower picture shows you some of the other little microhabitats, but we were determined to try and grow salsola. This is what salsola looks like up close in its natural habitat. It grows with these flakes of iron-rich sandstone, right? And we picked up 2 small salsola plants, did what I've just described, which is we put the soil on top, the seed-bearing soil, and salsola did nothing for the first 3 or 4 months, and when the rains came, it started growing. So what you're seeing here in the top picture and the bottom picture is one of the salsola plants beginning to spread its wings and show that it was completely at home where we placed it. And the lower one shows you salsola having grown more, right? And then this is a close-up of the salsola flowering madly in the very first year after it had started growing. And in fact, in Dr. Bhandari's book, which is the doyen of desert botanists, he wrote this definitive book about the desert. He says, I'm not describing the flowers of salsola because I haven't seen them. And here it was flowering like it was going out of style. So this was the salsola, this was one of the little microhabitats. And this is when we realized that this is a really nifty way, a really easy way of being able to bring back certain plants that are difficult to grow. And the key is really to bring back the soil which contains the minerals, right, that these plants will grow in. And this is something that we've continued to use as a device, as a method. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures about an area called Abha Mahal in the Nagaur Fort. Now, Nagaur Fort lies about 130 kilometers away from Jodhpur. And these vast fields that are divided into rectangular plots are what I was shown in 2015 and asked whether I would be willing to plant essentially what was a formal garden in Abha Mahal. And my first reaction was, look, I don't really like the idea of a formal garden. And maybe I'm the wrong person to ask to do this. But finally, what I negotiated with the people who run Abha Mahal was that I would be allowed to use native desert plants, and I would be allowed to bring soil in from the desert as the substrate for all these places. So in 2016 onwards, we started growing native desert plants, and some of it worked beautifully, some of it didn't work so well. But I want to show you in particular one particular kyari, one particular bed, which we dug down to the extent of about 8 feet. And we brought in one large dumper full of topsoil from near the Pakistan border that contained the seeds of this amazing plant called Phog. The local Marwari name is Phog. and the Latin name is Caligonum polygonoides, and that's what you see in the top layer, this very kind of wispy green, light green plant that you see, the tallest plant here. But also when you collect seeds, when you collect seed-bearing soil, you are also in effect collecting all the other little seeds which are companion plants of the community that lives together. So then you get all the other, these little yellow daisies that you see at the bottom, or the little white, the buoy that you see growing through it. So you get these marvelous effects, these wonderful effects just by collecting the soil and then, waiting for the rains. So this is one experiment that has worked very well. Because they wanted a more formal effect and not such a wild effect, what we did for part of this garden was to divide up some of the rectangles into parterres like this. But every plant you see in this picture is actually a wild plant. Most of these at the bottom are actually creepers, and they were given these little metal structures to grow on so that they looked as if they had similar forms. But every single one is actually a wild plant from the desert growing in soil that it likes, right? Now, just to come to close to the end of my pictures, from 2016 onwards, I, together with 3 very talented friends of mine, Golab Khandwal, who's an architect and a designer, Vijay Dasmana, who like me is a rewilder, and Harpreet Kaur, we got together to try and rewild some sand dunes that had blown into into an area of Jaipur city. And basically the sand had been stopped by Nahargarh Hill, which you see in this picture here. So it's really sand that has become like an obstruction dune at the base of a hill. And what we were shown when we were first taken to this area, which was called Kishan Bagh, was something like this. There were basically remnant dunes, water flowing off the hill had carved channels through the dunes. The dunes were all crumbly because there were people and animals and dogs and cattle and goats trampling all through this area. And our job was to see whether we could actually try and restore these dunes to something that resembled a natural landscape. This is a drone picture of those, dissected dunes that you see at the base of Nahargarh. So here again, we used basically the same idea. This is an area, this is a natural pog area in Western Rajasthan, roughly 120 kilometers west of Jaisalmer city, close to the border. And you can see that the entire area is dominated by one kind of bush. This is the same pog that I showed you in the context of Ava Mahal, right? And we said, how can we possibly get pog to grow in Kishan Bagh, right? So what we did in effect was we collected seed-bearing soil in these cement bags that you see loaded in the truck to the left. And we also collected several other kinds, something like 14 or 15 different kinds of soils, all belonging to different kinds of microhabitats. And then we basically seeded parts of the sand dunes with these soils. And that's essentially what we've been doing. This shows you the bottom of one of the sand dune areas before we began. And this is what happened, after it had been seeded with the buoy. We also then attempted to do what we'd done successfully in Jodhpur and in Nagaur by creating microhabitats where, once again, soils that were not suited in Kishan Bagh to grow other kinds of plants could be raised, could be placed into containers like you're seeing here. So this is the limestone soil on the top left being brought here. This is a salty sand on the right and at the bottom. And these were all placed into these microhabitats in order to grow the plants that we wanted to grow in these areas. Now, I'm not showing you all the pictures that we have for Kishenbag, but these are more recent pictures. The picture on the top left shows you a collection of all the microhabitats. There's a salty soil at about 3 o'clock on the top picture. There's a fresh water body and all the plants that grow there. There's a salty sand in the U-shaped arc. The bottom, there's iron-rich soil, there's a limestone soil, and so on. So the idea was to actually create a little mini museum of different kinds of soil in Kishenbag. And this is what Kishenbag looks like now. Obviously, this is taken in the rainy season, in September, just afterwards, which is why it's as green as it is. And this shows us the viewing deck that looks over all the dunes, which is the final point at which visitors who come to Kishenbag will actually be able to, finish their interpretive walk. And then finally, I've just got a picture to show you what Kishenbag looks like in relation to the city of Jaipur, because it's right in the city, it's not far away. And that brings me to the end of the pictures that I put together for this talk. So let's open it up for discussion now, David, if we can. And I'm very happy to field questions.
Yeah, thank you. There are a few questions. One second, let me read out. How do you manage to keep livestock out?
Well, it's tricky, but in Jodhpur, you see, in Jodhpur, we were very clear that the main reason why Prosopis juliflora comes back is basically in the poop of ungulates that eat the seeds, eat the fruit, right? So it is very important, at least for some years, to keep these animals out. At the same time, it seems a real pity to keep animals out. I mean, it would be best if we could actually have nilgai and chinkara and black buck. It's not really the right kind of ecology for black buck, but ideally we'd love to have all the creatures that normally live in these areas. But you have to think of scale. So in a place like Jodhpur, the scale of the Rewilding Park, it's roughly 70 hectares in size. Now 70 hectares in size is not the kind of area that can sustain a whole herd of nilgai, for example. So the old city wall had been repaired the year before we began working. And if we had not been able to protect the park and protect the grasses and protect the young trees, we couldn't have done that work. In Kishenbag, on the other hand, we've had nilgais coming in and doing damage right from the beginning. And we had to learn to actually curb our irritation and say, well, that's the way it is. Because in the case of Kishenbag, it actually abuts a wildlife sanctuary. And even though there is a fence that separates Kishenbag from the sanctuary, nilgais find it very simple to leap over a 7-foot fence and come in. So in effect, we're learning to live with browsers.
Okay. There's a question from Sharat Khanna. What was the impact on wildlife and bird life?
Well, in Rewilding Park, one of my big regrets was not actually having done a baseline survey of birds when we started. But you could imagine that with pretty much only Prosopis juliflora growing there when we started, the likelihood is that we would have had, and we've measured this in other places, something like 40, 45 species of birds. We now have 203 at the latest count.
Wow.
So it's, there's been an explosion of new things for different kinds of birds to eat, new places for, all kinds of insects to inhabit. So it's had an exponential effect in terms of bird life. So essentially we are a tiny island of 70 hectares in a busy metropolitan city, right? So the bird life has been amazing. We haven't tried to look at insects in a systematic way, but we can see visually, that it's been fantastic. One of the interesting things that was said to us right at the beginning was, we were paid a visit by an entomologist who said, do you have any idea how many kinds of termites you might have in Rajoda Park? And we said, no, tell us. And he said, well, I would not be surprised if you have over 15 different species of termites. And we found it very hard to imagine because this is rock, there's hardly any soil there. But his advice to us was, he said, what I would do is I would scatter dead twigs wherever, you're basically removing all this Prosopis juliflora, but all the little twigs of Prosopis juliflora, why don't you actually scatter in the park as food for the termites? Because the termites form the bottom of your food chain. And if your termite populations thrive, everything else is going to, increase in volume. And we did that. Now, we have no means of really knowing or measuring what effect it had, but it's, things seem to be doing really well. Next question. Hello?
Pradip, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Yeah. There's a question from Prerna Agarwal. Did
Yes.
you plant euphorbias? What was the source of water for plantation? Does the fire play any role in managing these ecosystems?
Okay, so euphorbias, yes. So basically, what you're planting in rock are plants that are able to grow in rock. And that while there's a small amount of plants that actually are quite, they can grow in both rock and sand, mostly they are mutually exclusive plants. And the reason is quite simple. Plants that grow in sand are able to invest all their energy in developing deep roots in order to reach moisture. Obviously, plants are unable to do that in rock, right? So there tends, for that reason, to be, an exclusivity between plants that grow in sand and those that grow in rock. Plants that grow in rock are called lithophytes, right? Litho as in lithos being rocks. So when we started collecting seeds and trying to grow seeds grow plants in our nursery, we're only looking at lithophytes for Rajoda Park. We're only looking at plants that are comfortable growing in volcanic, what I call acid rocks, acidic rocks. Euphorbia is one of the prime lithophytes in the western Rajasthan desert. And Euphorbia, in fact, we use Euphorbia caducifolia, which is called Thor in Rajasthan, as the logo for our plant because we realized that it actually is a little bit like, it's a nurse plant, it's like a little microhabitat in itself. Because if you look at large Thors, we've counted up to 25 other plants, including creepers, that grow inside a Thor. Because these plants actually, they take advantage of the fact that the Thor has spines and therefore it deters browsers. So they're safer growing inside a Thor. The Thor provides shade, therefore it's cooler for that reason. So lots of plants will actually, prefer to grow inside a Thor. We've actually found grasses that only grow inside a Thor. Not because they won't grow outside, but because the minute they grow outside, they get browsed by deer. And Thors are the only places where they actually manage to survive. So that's as far as Euphorbia is concerned. The second question was about soil. So we didn't change the soil, but we did experiment with using different kinds of soil mixtures for the little planting pots that had been created. And essentially because we didn't know when we started what was going to work best, we started with 3 different kinds of mixtures of soil, essentially different proportions of slightly clayey soil and the more sandy soil that you get in these areas. And we kept a record of which soil was working better for which plant. And that eventually became something we used. But more importantly, I met by accident on a train a man who, when I entered the compartment, said, he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a Mali." And he laughed and he said, "No, no, you can't be a Mali." I said, "Why can't I be a Mali?" So he said, "No, a Mali wouldn't have a big camera like you have." And I said, "Why can't a Mali have a big camera?" So, so I said, "You don't look like a Mali to me." Turns out that he was a man, he was a scientist who had been collecting mycorrhiza from the desert. And he had tried to patent a particular mycorrhiza. Basically, a mycorrhiza is like a fungus. It's a fungus that essentially of plants and has a symbiotic relationship with the plant. And especially in the desert and especially in rocky areas, what a lot of these fungi can do is they can actually make minerals that are locked up in rocks available to plants, which would otherwise not be available to them. And in return, the plants feed sugars to the mycelium, and that's how you get this mutualism between the mycorrhiza. So basically, this chance encounter on a train allowed us to actually buy some of the material that he was growing as propagules, which we then place inside the growing medium whenever we're growing plants. So the combination of these kinds of soils, natural soils, and the mycelium was what we were using. And to answer the third part of your question about the watering, so
And the fire also. Fire played a major role.
fire. I'll come to fire after this. But
Okay.
water is very interesting because when we first began, you have to remember that I didn't have any previous experience of working in the desert before. And one of the things that you imagine is that the first thing you have to do is to somehow harvest water, collect water, harvest it, right? So we got busy making our contour trenches and doing our bunding and seeing what we could do. How could we arrest the runoff of the little bit of rainwater that we got? And then it struck me sometime in the second year that, look, when we go out looking for plants in the desert, in rocky parts of the Thar Desert, nobody's going around, making contour bunds and contour trenches and harvesting water here. And yet, these places are sometimes absolutely thrillingly, populated with plants that all have different parts of the rocky scape that they grow in, right? And we said maybe the key to growing, the key to gardening, I'm using the word gardening in inverted commas, in a place like Rajyoga Park, is to try and understand the kind of particular site qualities that plants are looking for within a rocky habitat. So we stopped doing any kind of water harvesting whatsoever. And we learned by trial and error what plants needed. And we came to a point by year 6 where we said no plant needs to be watered once it is established. So basically the method was that we were planting in the monsoon, sometimes just before the monsoon, watering till no more than about the beginning of December or at the very most at the beginning of January. After which we were letting these plants be on their own. And if we saw a plant that was dying for lack of water, we said, let it die, because this plant is obviously the wrong plant in the wrong place. And we need to replace it with a plant that is capable of living in this particular site. So watering, unless you can do that, you're not going to get a sustainable park. There's no way that you could go around watering all these plants in 70 hectares, right? Sorry, there's a question about fire.
Yeah. Yes.
Well, it's not a fire-prone area in particular, partly because there isn't a lot of tinder. Unlike the spinifex that you get in Australian deserts, for example, you don't get a lot of, you get grass, right? But you also have a lot of rock, and the grass is sparse. So you don't have that kind of, thick ground cover that will allow fires. So when fires happen, we had one fire, for example, because of a rocket that came in during Diwali. and set fire to a patch of grass, but it died out within a few yards. It didn't really. So in Rewilding Park, which is rocky and where you don't get continuous swathes of dry grass in the dry season, it hasn't been a problem. And you can actually tell whether or not a particular kind of ecology is prone to fires by the nature of the bark of certain trees. For example, if you have moringas growing there, the wild Moringa conconensis, tends to have a very corky bark. And corky barks are always a good sign that this is a plant that actually is used to growing in places that are fire prone to ground fires, right? So the cork actually protects protects the inside of the tree, remains quite safe. In Kisharag, which is sandy and where you can get much more continuous grassy areas. And we've just had to basically create fire lines so that the whole place doesn't go up in flames.
Okay. There's a lot of questions are piling up. Pradip, for about 42 messages. So probably I'll go through most of it.
But choose the nicest ones.
Yes. Okay. 1 second. There's a question from Jayant Kulkarni. What are the benefits and losses of removing prosopis and introducing other native species? Did you try Anajosis pendula? What do you think about neem? I think it's not a native species.
So first, let me just tell you a little bit about prosopis. Prosopis is, as I said, an exotic invasive species. And one of its characteristics is that it secretes an alkaloid in its, a chemical in its root zone. And what the chemical does basically is it inhibits any other plant from being able to grow close to the root zone. So that's one of its weapons in its arsenal. It also is immensely hardy. It flowers and fruits twice a year. And essentially, if you leave it, in India, all over in dry areas, we found that wherever you have prosopis growing, it basically starts to outcompete everything else. And in a relatively short amount of time, you therefore get monocultures of this invasive species that has outcompeted everything else that is native, that doesn't have, basically, it doesn't produce leaves, foliage that are browsed by anything. Birds, very few birds actually nest in prosopis. So ecologically, it doesn't have much that recommends it to as something that you like. So, Maharaj Umed Singh would have scattered the seeds with the best of intentions, without any idea, any knowledge that this is what he would have been doing. But prosopis comes into India in the 1880s because foresters, you can imagine that foresters, when they're faced with degraded areas, with scrublands, with wastelands, they're looking for something hardy. They're looking for something that's going to not need a lot of looking after, because you cannot, on a large scale, go around watering things. And this was the answer that, basically foresters found in the, at the end of the 19th century, but it had disastrous effects in Kutch, where it wiped out entire grasslands. The Delhi Ridge, near where I live, the central ridge is, 95% of it is now Prosopis juliflora, because it's the only plant that actually managed to grow among the different kinds that they tried to plant there. So Prosopis is not a good fellow. Now, the next question was Anogeisys, right? So Anogeisys pendula is one of my favorite trees. It's an amazing tree, but it has a lot of things that make it very special. And I'm just very briefly going to tell you about it. One is that it's clonal. So it's called a habitat specialist because on dry, rocky, steep slopes where it grows in the Aravallis, it's the only tree that is actually capable of growing in these conditions. So it specializes in growing in steeply sloping rocky hills. How it does it? It's not clear because it doesn't have succulent roots. It doesn't even necessarily have very deep roots. And one of the pendula is how it actually manages to survive when nothing else is able to survive. But what it does do is that in this particular harsh ecology, where it's very hard for seeds to germinate, it manages to send runners underground, even in rocky conditions. And from the ends of these runners, new trunks, new trees will emerge. But if you think about it, these are all part of the same tree. They share the same DNA. So you can actually have 100 or 1,000 trunks that look like they're all separate trees. They're actually all the same. They're clones of the same tree. They're all actually the same tree. So it's a giant, it can form giant organisms. And that's one of its ways of coping with these conditions. The other wonderful thing about Anagaisis is that it's highly responsive to moisture. So you give it one little, what's called a chhanta of rain. Chhanta is a Marwari word, which means just a little sprinkling of rain, and it goes green. And then the green may not last if the moist conditions don't last, but it's highly responsive. It also has this amazing way of, if the growing tips, the meristems are browsed, it starts growing sideways, because the side shoots, basically the hormones get distributed to the side shoots, and it forms these lovely mats, strong, springy mats that can then grow, all across and covering some of these rocks. So Anagaisis is a wonderful tree. We have grown it in Jodhpur because it is actually found there in small quantities. But the other puzzle about Anagaisis pendula is that it is only found along the Aravalli range, starting near Delhi and going right down to Gujarat, and on a very small bit of hilly country that crosses the Aravallis in the form of the Vindhyas, roughly sort of 3/4 of the way north along the range. And that's why you get it at all in Jodhpur. So what we've done is we've actually planted Anagaisis pendula in the little micro valleys that you get in Rajodha Park, and they're utterly beautiful. I'm very, very proud of them.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Preeti. How many years it took for these experiments? What were the impediments considering the harsh climatic conditions?
How many years for? So basically, Rajodha Park, we started on the 1st of April 2006. We wanted to be completely correct in terms of the financial year. So it's been, 16 years. I've, in fact, just given up being director of the park. So as of the 31st of March 2020, I am not any longer director of Rajodha Park, although I'll be visiting quite a lot and I'll be keeping an eye on what's going on. So it's taken that long, and it'll take longer, I think, for the park to reach a kind of maturity. But it's already got enough in it, I think, to satisfy most visitors. We now have a visitor center. We have really well-trained naturalists who do a superb job taking people in when they want them to go with them. Kishanbagh is only 3 years old, 3.5 years old now. And with Kishanbagh, our big worry is that once we hand it over back to the Jaipur Development Authority, which is a wing of the Rajasthan government, we don't quite know what's going to happen to it, because we feel that if it is given out to one of the normal horticultural contractors, which is the way JDA normally works, that will very quickly be, I think, the end of whatever we've done. So we're trying to influence that if we possibly can, but we don't know whether that's really going to be possible.
Okay. Thank you. There's a question from Ms. Subramanya.
Yeah.
What other invasive species you had to deal with other than Prosopis?
In Jodhpur?
Yes.
Among trees, almost nothing. I mean, other than Prosopis juliflora as a, among the invasive trees, luckily we didn't have subabul, lucina, growing there. And we don't, and even shisham can be quite invasive actually. Shisham is not exotic, but it's exotic to that particular ecology. And shisham can be quite invasive. We've seen in sandy areas as well. So we haven't had any other invasive trees in Jodhpur, but lots of other invasive plants. And also some plants which we've had to, even if the plant is actually native, we've had to label it invasive and get rid of it because it, outcompetes other things. So for example, one of the exotics that we have inside the park is a plant called Stevia grandiflora. This is a plant that came in from Madagascar during the First World War and was brought to India because it has a milky latex that can be made into a rubber. And they wanted, basically the British were looking for ways of making rubber for aeroplane tires in the First World War. But very quickly people realized that this was not economic and productive enough, and it was allowed to, they stopped using the latex, and it was allowed to run wild. And Cryptostegia, which is called in Hindi, it's called rubber bale, appropriately enough. So we have some exotic rubber bale growing inside Raujoda Park, but we've allowed it to grow because it's not particularly aggressive. It grows in particular places. It grows in the Hathi Nala where you get some seasonal water flowing. It doesn't really grow outside the areas where there's water flowing. So we're keeping an eye on it, but we allow it to happen. Okay. There's a fair amount of smaller, herbaceous, and some shrubby invasives that we get rid of. Lantana obviously is one of them, but lantana doesn't really do particularly well in the desert. Lantana is much more of a problem in places like Kishanbagh and places like Delhi.
Okay. So many questions are piling up. Okay, there's a question from Alok. Like Oropitium, are there any other species of grass helpful?
Well, grasses are really, really, really important to any kind of rewilding that you do. And the trouble is that, there's not enough information that's really available out there for people like us who are coming to it without vast experience to understand exactly what needs to be done. So what we were doing basically was we realized by reading Bhandari Saab's book that there was something like 74 species of lithophytic grasses that find it congenial to live in rocky areas. So 74 lithophytic grasses in the Thar Desert. And we actually managed to collect about 71. So there's 3 that we haven't managed to propagate in the park. And what we did essentially with these grasses was we grew them in patches without really knowing how they would interact with each other, whether some would overwhelm others, whether others, some would shrink back and not be able to compete. And a lot of that information is going to become available 3, 4, 5, 6 years hence when the grasses have managed to spread to other areas in the park. We're keeping an eye on what's happening, but no other grass. So grasses are really important for various reasons. For one, they bind the soil. If they weren't there, you'd get a lot more soil blowing away. For 2, when grasses die, they enrich the soil. They provide nitrogen to the soil. For 3, they provide food for all kinds of creatures from insects upwards and birds. But they also, are, a lot of work that I've been reading recently talks about how grasses and shrubs actually provide little zones in which it's much easier for other plants to grow. So there's a kind of knock-on effect. So if you have a patch of grass, it's easier for other plants to find purchase in a grassy area than it would be if it was a completely bare area. but no other grass that I know of performs the same function that Oropitium does as a plant that colonizes rock and binds the soil to that degree.
Thank you. There's a question, there's two questions actually I clubbed it. Does the unique formation of new ecosystem bring changes in water cycle and any changes in groundwater in this area?
Well, it's hard to say about groundwater because you can imagine that it's really, really hard for us to, to find out what's happening with groundwater in a rocky park like Rewilding Park, except that we have lakes there. We have two lakes that sort of fill up in the rains and then get depleted. And we have found that compared to the first 3 years when there was very little vegetation, the lakes have become much larger in size. We don't really know what the connection is, why this should be so. So I don't really have a good answer to that. Nor do I know what effect it's having, on subsoil water. But certainly in sandy areas, I'm sure that there would be a very direct connection. Next question.
Okay. There's been quite a few times this question popped up, so I have to ask this.
Yeah.
Who funded these various projects? What were the budget, or how do you manage it? Is long project?
All right. So in the case of Rewilding Park, basically the land belongs to the Mehrangarh Fort, which is a museum. A museum. The entire fort is a museum, and it's run by a public charitable trust that is called the Mehrangarh Museum Trust, MMT. So I was first invited by the CEO of the trust to come. He brought me to the edge of what later became the park, and he said, would you be willing to green this area for us? And that's how it began. And when I first saw it, my first reaction was, wow, what an amazing place. But it was also a very daunting idea. And the biggest doubt I had was, how am I going to sell the idea of doing an ecological restoration to the trust? Because this is clearly not what they had in mind. When I asked them, I said, what exactly do you mean when you say green it? And I said, look, if by greening it, you think you're going to have, grassy meadows and, flowering trees, exotics all over the place, are you prepared to literally bring in several million tons of soil? And are you willing to water every single plant for the rest of your lives? And he looked at me and said, well, obviously not. So then I said, well, then the only practical way of doing this is to actually try and restore this area with plants that are going to be completely sustainable on their own, right? And the only way to do that is to go out into the desert and to look for plants that already inhabit similar rocky parts of the desert. So that's how the project began. We drew up a budget for the first year, which was something like 25 or 26 lakhs for basically going out, raising plants, employing the Marwari miners to start removing the Bavlia and all that. The budget has gone up steadily over the years and is now roughly in the region of 40 lakhs a year. But then it includes things like security for the entire park, the salaries of people who work, the naturalists, all the people who work in the park as gardeners, a supervisor, all the nursery staff, all of that. So the park is funded by the Mehrangarh Museum Trust, MMT, and the MMT funds the park basically through the sale of tickets to the fort. And you can imagine that the fort gets something like 1.4 million visitors a year. So it's not, it's not too difficult for them to actually support the park. And I imagined that the park would never really be truly independent because it would always need support from the trust. But roughly 3 years ago, we found for the first time that we're actually making something like 70% of our costs from the sale of tickets at our visitor center. And this came as a huge surprise to us. Something that was really, really welcome. And I'm pretty confident now that within the next 2 or 3 years, Rajola Park will become self-sustaining economically.
Okay. There's a question from Vaidehi.
Yeah.
Please shed some light on use of native plants. What database do you refer for all these projects in India? Is there a website or app we can refer for native plants?
No, there isn't really, but basically India has been, there are floras about most parts of this country. Floras that go back to British times, but the Botanical Survey of India and other organizations have actually produced floras for, in many cases, district-wise floras for most parts of this country. So, for example, recently I was asked by WWF to try and draw up lists of native trees for other cities in India. And it's not very difficult to actually source material, some of it on the net, but most of it you actually have to buy books that are essentially floras, local floras, that give you information about native plants. But there isn't an app, I'm afraid, no. And our major source was Professor Bhandari's book, the Flora of the Thar Desert. And that's really what you have to go by. Yeah, next. David? Have I lost you?
No, I'm here. Sorry, I was muted. Okay, there's a question from Chandini Patel. Juliflora has always been ignored, look like invasive. We always try to remove, but this plant actually support many fauna and fauna as well as hold water and prevent soil erosion. Is there any ways we can actually acknowledge it exists in the plant, other plants? Because the kind of practice we need to come up with as well. I mean.
Yeah, I've heard the argument before that what Prosopis does is that, first of all, it provides habitat to smaller animals, especially, so things like hares and, smaller animals. Certainly it'll bind soil. I mean, anything with, deep roots will bind soil.